Morning. I'm Paul Campbell III, and it is Thursday, September the 3rd, 1998. We are in the conference room at Chambliss, Bonner, and Stoffel in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where, as part of a Tennessee Bar Foundation project, we're going to interview Mr. Jac Chambliss. The Chambliss Law Firm is the oldest law firm in Chattanooga, which still practices under the name of its founding partner. On the wall here behind Jac is a portrait of Justice Alexander Wiles Chambliss, who was the founder of the firm, and Jac Chambliss, his grandfather. For the sake of our audience, I probably ought to confess that we're cousins, so that I know a fair amount of the family background. But it is a rich family background in the law, and we have seen a minute before a portrait of your grandfather. I think it would be helpful for our audience if you could give us a bit of your family's background in the law in Tennessee.
Paul, my grandfather, Alexander Wiles Chambliss, was born in 1864 in Greenville, South Carolina, to John Alexander Chambliss, who was a Baptist minister and had been a chaplain in Lee's army. When my grandfather was 17 and had finished prep school, he went to Warrenton, Virginia, and read law and was licensed. He then moved down to Memphis when he was about 20, and then moved eastwardly to Brownsville, Tennessee, where he met and married Lillian Carter Nelson, whose father was a plantation owner over there. Then my grandfather came to Chattanooga and surveyed it in 1885, and in 1886 he moved here with my grandmother, and my father was born here in 1887. My grandfather practiced from 1886 till 1923, when he went on the Supreme Court and stayed there until his death in 1947. At the time he went on, he was a prominent lawyer here and had done some remarkable things. When he was in his 30s, he'd been a state senator. And then in 1910, he was elected mayor of Chattanooga. He was elected 4 times and was actually a mayor at the time he went on the Supreme Court.
Jac, we're talking about the Tennessee Supreme Court, right?
Tennessee Supreme Court, that's right. And because of his being there and because of my being as close to him as I was, I got acquainted with all the justices and was familiar with the proceedings over there and everything. And my other grandfather, incidentally, my grandfather Sizer, joined my grandfather Chambliss as partner in 1910 because at that time John Chambliss, my father, married my mother, Margaret Sizer. And Mr. Sizer was a very fine Chancery Court lawyer. And he saved the life of the Coca-Cola Company in the teens when the government tried to put them out of business.
Jac, why don't you give us the name of that case, if you remember it?
I think it's the United States versus 40 barrels of Coca-Cola or something like that. The book about it is on the shelf over there in our library.
That's a case that went to the United States Supreme Court, is it not?
It went to the Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court, and was won.
As I recall, the United States government was taking the position that the formula for Coca-Cola violated the Food and Drug Acts.
That's right.
And that one of the really offensive ingredients was caffeine.
That is, well, they thought it was cocaine, and because of the name Coke. And that was a very important thing, and a little sidelight on it, after the case was won, my grandfather Chambliss told my grandfather Sizer, said, "I don't agree on a fee in this till I get back from England." And he left for England and came back, and my grandfather Sizer had decided to agree on a fee because the people had pushed him. And so father said to him, "What did you agree on?" He said, "Well, they offered me $35,000 in cash, or half of it in cash and half in stock in the company, and I took the cash." And of course that changed the whole course of the family.
Yeah, that's why you're still lawyers.
That's why I'm still working, that's right.
Your grandfather Chambliss, as you have mentioned, went on to the Tennessee Supreme Court in the 1920s and was still there at the time of his death.
Yeah.
And at the time of his death had been elected to be the Chief Justice of that court.
That's right.
And help us a little bit. There was a great uncle or an uncle. Didn't Justice Chambliss have a brother that was in the practice with him at one time?
Yes, as a matter of fact, soon after he began to practice here in 1886, his younger brother Sam Chambliss came here with him. He was about 2 years younger, and he practiced with him until about 1917 when he died. And he didn't have any other, well, he had another brother, but he was a banker over in Brownsville, Tennessee.
Well, now, just quickly, the Sam Chambliss line, he has a great-grandson that is still practicing law in Atlanta.
That's correct, whose name is Sam Chambliss.
Yes. And your father followed in his father's footsteps and became a lawyer.
Right. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about his career?
About my
Your father's career.
He had a very colorful career. He went through high school and several places, having considerable difficulty. And then he went to VMI for a few years, and he came out of VMI after 3 years and went to night law school here in Chattanooga, graduated and realized he needed to study more, so he went to Michigan Law School and graduated there. And he began to practice in 1909, and he married Mother in 1910. And he continued to practice until his death in 1972. And after my grandfather Sizer's death in 1938, my father, John Chambliss, was head of the firm. He was general counsel for the Provident, and he represented all kinds of people and was an entrepreneur too, and was a very colorful character. One of the chief things he's known for here in Chattanooga has nothing to do with the law. It's the fact that he and Mother put together the arboretum out in the West Valley below Lookout Mountain called Reflection Riding. And that was a thing that was very close to his heart. But he was a very ingenious lawyer and a very capable lawyer and a very stimulating person to be around.
In addition to being a lawyer and a lover of the outdoors, he was also something of an inventor.
He was indeed. He had several patents. He invented a fire alarm device called the
Firetail.
Firetail, that's correct. And also a mowing device called the spin slicer, and several other things. He had a very fertile and active mind.
Well, now, just a minute before we move on to your career. At one time, the Chambliss firm was connected with sort of the top academic treatises in Tennessee law.
That's correct. My grandfather Sizer, who, as I say, was a chancery lawyer primarily, edited Wills and Estates by Pritchard. And actually, he was a partner of Mr. Pritchard when he and my grandfather Chambliss went together. And my father, John Chambliss, edited Gibson Suits in Chancery, which was the leading book on chancery practice in Tennessee for a long time.
There's one last story I'd like you to tell our audience about your great-grandfather, and that involves a trip to New York that he took with Mr. Adolph Ox.
Yes. In the late 80s or early 90s, I've forgotten just what the year was, but Mr. Ox, who was a few years older than my grandfather, who was in his 30s at that time, went with Mr. Ox to New York, where Mr. Ox bought the New York Times. And there was a close friendship between them, and one of my valued documents is a letter that Mr. Ox wrote to my grandfather Chambliss when he ran for mayor the first time. So they had that contact.
Now, when we speak of your grandfather in the 80s or 90s, we're talking about the 1880s and 1890s, aren't we?
That's correct.
Well, come forward for us, if you will, and tell us a little bit about your education and background.
I had almost as diverse an education as my father. I went to Webb School in Bell Buckle, finished there, and then went to VMI, and left VMI a year and a half later because I got into a difficulty that involved throwing a bomb into the courtyard. And it was an interesting experience. VMI meant a great deal to me. VMI VMI and Webb School meant more to me than anything. After I went there, though, that was in 1929, and I came home, and in the summer of 1929, my father took me and my next two brothers and a friend, Carl Cartenhauer, to England. And we went over there and went down to see Mr. Kipling. He wasn't at home at the time, but we visited his home there.
This is Rudyard Kipling?
The Rudyard Kipling, who my father used to read to us as children a great deal. The Jungle Books and the poems and things like that, and I memorized a lot of the poems. Came back, and he then sent me to Northwestern Law School. I was 18 at the time, and so I could go to a class taught in evidence by Dean Wigmore.
Now, Dean Wigmore and your father were friends, were they not?
They were friends. My father was a friend with a lot of legal people that were up at the top and so forth, and he was quite a legal scholar, much more so than I. And then after that, I went to Southwestern College for 2 years. I didn't graduate because I didn't have enough credits. But at the end of the 2 years, the Depression had hit. My father wrote me a letter, and he said, "Jack, I don't have any money, and I can't send you to college anymore. But even if I could, I don't think I would, because I think you have epilepsy of the interest," which I did indeed. I was playing tenor banjo in a dance band, and I was doing a lot of boxing and various things like that, and drawing.
All right, now, Jack, before we get on to how your legal education started,
Yeah.
two things. I think we probably should note that the experience at VMI, the bomb was not a terrorist bomb. This was this was sound effects.
That's correct.
A second thing, just for those who have the literary interest, is you became friends with one of your teachers at Southwestern, who went on to become perhaps the foremost man of American letters at the time of his death.
That's correct. Robert Penn Warren came to Southwestern for his first teaching assignment after he left Oxford. And Warren and I became good friends, and he introduced me to his friends up in Nashville, the Fugitive Group. And then he moved on down to LSU, and in 1934, when I married my wife, Bina McVeigh, who was from Baton Rouge, Warren was in our wedding. And we continued our friendship until his death. And he was a very special person in my life and my career.
One of the bits of data that we've probably left out in terms of charting your life and career is your birthday.
October 21st, 1910.
If you will, then, let's go back and pick up with how your legal education got started, since your father had told you he wasn't going to fund you anymore.
Well, that left me in something of a dilemma. And then my grandfather, Alexander, came to my rescue. And he said, "Jack, if you want to go to law school, I will pay for you to go to Cumberland. I'll pay the tuition, and I will give you $50 a month to live on." And I took him up. He had already given me an A Model Ford Roadster, so I had transportation. And so I went to Cumberland in the fall of 1931, and graduated the following May of 1932. It was a one-year law school. And all that you had to have to get into the law school was the equivalent of a high school education. And I had that. I didn't have much more, but I had that.
At the time that it was in operation, Cumberland was just about the oldest law school in the country, was it not?
Just about. It was founded about 1836. And the Judge Green, who was then, when I was in law school, he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Tennessee. And his father had been ahead of him on the court and had a great deal to do with the law school. So I went there, and one of my friends from Southwestern roomed with me in a boarding house, and we paid $15 a month for the room, and we bought a meal ticket for $25 a month somewhere else. And my roommate's name was Jefferson Davis, and he was from Indianola, Mississippi, and so I sometimes tell an audience that I had the honor of going to law school with Jefferson Davis, and it makes an impression.
Yeah, it makes you sound a little bit older than you are, isn't it?
That's right.
The Cumberland Law School eventually sold its name and is now in Alabama.
Samford.
Samford. It's part of the Samford University. At the time that you attended, and at the time that it was in its heyday for Tennessee lawyers, where was it?
It was at Lebanon, Tennessee, which is about 35 miles out of Nashville, eastwardly.
You mentioned Jefferson Davis a minute ago. I think you had told me that he went on to have a fairly distinguished and successful
Yes, he
career
went
in the
back
law,
to
too.
Mississippi and was, for a time, Assistant Attorney General there. Then he went with the Southern Bell Telephone Company and what became the General Counsel there.
All right.
And Jeff he was the head of captain of the football team in Southwestern, weighed about 260 pounds. And I was the captain of the boxing team and weighed 130 pounds. And so we made an odd couple.
I assume. You finished law school then in 1932, and at the time that you finished, did you return to Chattanooga?
Yes, I drove back to Chattanooga, and the afternoon that I got home, my father told me that I was going to have to try a case the next day.
Tell us about that case, if you will.
He said, Jack, he said, the Tag Railroad. Now, the Tag Railroad was a short line railroad, 96 miles long, that ran from Chattanooga down to Gadsden, Alabama, down the east side of Lookout Mountain.
And its name was formed?
Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. And my father and 3 other men had bought it out of bankruptcy for $50,000, the whole railroad. And they sold it 3 years later to a New York outfit for $400,000, but my father stayed in it. Well, anyway, this was in 1932, and he said the Tag has been sued for running over a foxhound down the line there. And I tried the case before a justice of the peace and lost it, and now I've appealed, and the appeal goes to the same justice and a jury of 5 countrymen. And so you've got to go down and try it tomorrow. So I went to the foot of the mountain the next morning, picked up the train crew, and we drove down to Kensington, Georgia, which is on the east side of the mountain. And the squire was the justice of the peace was a storekeeper, and he had his store up on the side of the mountain, and it had stilts in front of it, if you know what I mean, because the mountain was so steep there. And so we went in, and the squire was there behind the counter, and there were 5 jurors sitting around on bales of hay and sacks of feed and things like that. And Frank Gleason was the lawyer on the other side, and he and his client were there.
Now, for those of us who aren't around or weren't around here, you need to describe Mr. Gleason, or Colonel Gleason, as he liked to be called.
Frank was a very colorful character. He had moved down here from up north. He was a Yankee, and he had started practicing down in North Georgia. And he was a rather small man physically, but a fireball. And I had not met him before. But he put on his client, and his clients, incidentally, he became quite a colorful figure in the whole area. And he didn't know about what I'm going to tell you until shortly before his death. Anyway, he put on his witness, and the man said he had this valuable foxhound and had been running it on this particular night, and about 12:30 in the middle of the night was the last time he heard the foxhound sound off. And about that same time, he heard the Tag train whistle. And the next morning, he found the dog dead under the trestle. And so that was his case. Well, I put on the train crew. There were only 3 on the train crew, the engineer, the fireman, and the brakeman. They only had 2 or 3 cars on the train, and they were all up in the locomotive as they went across that trestle. And so they all testified that the train was proceeding 10 or 15 miles an hour, and that the headlight was on, and that there wasn't any dog on the trestle, and that they didn't run over the dog. Well, that was the case. We argued the case to the jury, and Frank talked about the Tag Railroad coming down the valley, scattering chickens, ducks, cattle, this, that, and the other, and slaughtering things, and how dangerous it was. And he says, you've heard the evidence. I want a judgment for the plaintiff here. And I then told him, I said, you all know the Tag better than I do. If it goes over 15 miles an hour, it jumps the track. It's like the Tunaville trolley, and you've heard these gentlemen say they were on the train and that it didn't run over the dog because the dog wasn't there. And that's the case. Well, the jury then retired and went outside and sat around on some rocks under a big elm tree, scratched their heads and chewed tobacco. And after a little bit, they came back, and the squire came out on the porch, and he said, have you gentlemen arrived at a verdict? They said, yes, Your Honor. How do you find? We find for the defendant railroad. Well, I nearly fell off the porch. I mean, I couldn't believe it. So anyway, I said, let's get out of here. Something's wrong about this. So we were getting in the car and driving off, and I noticed the train crew looking at each other out of the corner of their eyes. And I said, something's going on. Tell me about it. They said, well, Jack, this is what it was. We were on train number 1 that went south that night, and we crossed the trestle at 12:30. and there wasn't any dog there. But train number 2 came north at 3 o'clock, and it killed that dog. So I'd taken the wrong crew and won the lawsuit. That got me off to an auspicious beginning.
I guess you probably should have retired then.
That's right. I didn't tell Frank about it till a few years ago.
Before we do some more with your actual legal career, there's one other thing about the family that I think that we might talk about. You were one of 6 children.
That's right.
One of 4 sons.
Yeah.
And your youngest brother, David, died during World War II.
That's right.
But with that exception, the other 3 brothers all became lawyers. Will you tell us a little bit about them and their careers?
Yes. In the first place, let me say that David, who was killed in the war, left Vanderbilt Law School to go in the service, and is buried over in England, by the way. But my next brother, Bob, went to Michigan Law School and graduated about 1937 or 8, and came back to Chattanooga and went with an uncle by marriage named Albert Tabor, who had a tax practice and wills and estate practice here. And Bob was with him, and it was Tabor Chambliss, then later Tabor Chambliss, Swafford and Clauch, and then after that Tabor died, and they brought in the Stoffels. And so ultimately the Stoffels were the only ones left. And then the Stoffels merged with our firm this last year.
Now, your brother Bob was killed rather tragically in an automobile accident,
He
sort
was
of in his prime.
He was in an automobile going up to the Provident for a meeting of the McClellan Foundation, and his car was going on a green light across Broad Street, and a drunken driver came along and ran the red light and ran into his car and killed him.
I think he was 52 at the time or something like that.
That's right, yeah.
Now, as a way of demonstrating how pervasive the law and the family connections are, Bob left 2 daughters, both of whom are lawyers in Seattle, Washington.
That is correct.
And you had a brother, Sizer, who had a rather interesting legal career.
Yes, Sizer started out to be a doctor, and then got out of that, and he was in the Navy just prior to the war for a while, and he came out and went to night law school and became a lawyer. And he was with my father during World War II. You see, when I came back here, the firm was Chambliss, it was Sizer, Chambliss, and Kefauver, Estes Kefauver. And the Chambliss was my father, the Sizer was my grandfather Sizer, and Estes Kefauver was the other one. Then my uncle Bernard Sizer was there too. But when war came along, Kefauver, who had gone into politics, moved to another place in town here, and took Bernard Sizer with him, and 1 or 2 other lawyers who were with the firm. My grandfather Sizer had died in 1938.
But for the sake of any younger audience we have, Estes Kefauver, who was with the firm, was twice the United States Senator from Tennessee.
That's right.
And came very close to being the Democratic nominee for the presidency in 1956.
That's correct.
And ended up running on the ticket with Adlai Stevenson as the vice president.
That's correct.
Of course, they were beaten by the Eisenhower ticket, but he still had a very distinguished political career in Tennessee. I think we've covered the brothers. You had 2 sisters, and at least one of those married a lawyer.
That's right. My sister Margaret married Lamont Johnston. She's my youngest. She's the youngest in the family. She married Lamont Johnston, who was a patent lawyer. And my sister Susan married not a lawyer, but an insurance man named Jim Irvin.
But she produced
a lawyer, Nelson Irvin, who is one of the partners in this firm now.
And is really the last family member in the firm.
He's the last family member in the firm, that's correct.
Okay. Okay, you have told us the story about the Tag Railroad and how you began as a lawyer. You had a varied practice. It wasn't just trial work. What sort of work did you do other than trial work?
Well, I've formed corporations. I formed a company called Welding Gas Products Company when I was in my 20s. And in that case, and it's a right interesting situation, National Cylinder Gas Company, or maybe it was Compressed Industrial Gases, one of the big national companies, wanted to get into the Chattanooga area. but they had a gentleman's agreement with the other big company that they wouldn't come in there. And this was in the 30s. And so they told 3 of their salesmen, said, you go in and start a company, an independent company, and we'll put up the money and put up the machinery and all, and you all will own 51% of it forever. And so they came to me, and I formed the company, and it got started, and it did quite well. And in about 2 or 3 years, the big company decided that they wanted to take it over. So they sniped off one of the stockholders, and that gave them control. Well, the president of the company then came to me and said, what can we do about it? I said, well, the thing to do is to issue additional stock to yourself. It's illegal, but you can issue the stock and pay for it on a note. So that's what we did. Thereupon, the other company, the big company, got General Frierson, who had been Solicitor General of the United States, to file suit in Chancery Court on the ground that what we had done was illegal. And so we went into court and we said, yes, it's illegal. But they violated their promise. And the lower court held against us. But we took it to the Court of Appeals. And Bill Brown was in the case with me, William G. Brown, who was not a partner of mine at that time, but later was. And he was very helpful. And we argued the case in the Court of Appeals, and they reversed and held in our favor. And then they took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court affirmed the Court of Appeals.
You had mentioned earlier, I believe, that your grandfather had helped form or found Provident Life Insurance Company.
Yes, that was one of the big things that he did. He formed and founded a number of other companies, but Provident, he represented Mr. Thomas McClellan, who had come down from Canada and came to Chattanooga and bought a little mutual accident and health insurance company that was a mutual company that sold nickel and dime policies in the coal fields of Kentucky particularly. And in 1910, Mr. McClellan decided that he wanted to change it into a regular insurance company and a stock company. And so I'd never heard of that being done, that you would change a mutual company into a stock company. But they did it, and my grandfather did it and raised most of the money to get the Provident started. And of course, it has become one of the biggest companies in the United States. And he got me into the picture way back. Mr. Thomas McClellan died about 1916 in an automobile accident, and Mr. Robert J. McClellan, his son, took over. Mr. Robert J. McClellan was not an experienced person in handling meetings or things like that. So in my early years as a lawyer, I would go to the stockholders meeting, my grandfather having given me some stock, and he always presided. And so I got to be very close to the company, and after my grandfather went on the Supreme Court, of course, he quit being general counsel, and my father became general counsel. And then later on, by that time they had a home office counsel, so I wasn't general counsel, but I was trial counsel. And that has continued until the last few years when the company has changed.
But the Provident was one of the clients of the Chambliss firm for years and years.
It was indeed.
I think it's probably clear to our audience from listening to you that the trial work maybe is your favorite part of the law. You had told some other...
It definitely has been. As a matter of fact, I probably ought not to say this, but a lawyer who is not a trial lawyer is not quite a lawyer to me. He may be skilled in certain branches of the law, but unless he is able to go into court and be an advocate, I really think he's of a different breed. And I wish that in this country, instead of having what we have, calling everybody lawyers, we had solicitors and barristers as they do in England, because there's definitely a distinction. In our firm here, we have about 50 lawyers, I guess, and I don't think over maybe 8 or 10 of them are trial lawyers.
Tell us a little bit about, I think you have told me before, about a case that you handled involving a labor dispute that is an interesting, I think, example of lawyering skills in a day before discovered.
In the 1930s, when I was in my mid-20s, we represented a company called Bennett Hubbard Candy Company here in town, and there was a strike, and it was a violent strike. And my father, who had represented Bennett Hubbard, had gone to England and left me in charge of it. And it was a difficult situation. But one day, several of the strikers followed some of the workers home out into the country where they lived and proceeded to beat them up unmercifully. And so I then went into criminal court to get these people put under a peace bond. We have a Tennessee statute that if anyone commits a breach of the peace or threatens to commit a breach of the peace, you can make bond that they will not do that. And if they do it again, they forfeit the bond and get arrested. So it's a very good device, and it still exists. I seldom hear of it being used, but it's good. Anyway, I got a criminal lawyer to go with me to criminal court, to Judge Lusk, and I put on my proof, and these witnesses testified that they had been assaulted, as I said, and that was my case. And then the defendants began to testify, and they were represented by H.G.B. King, who was the labor lawyer around here and my frequent antagonist and my good friend, I might say. But they got on the stand and they swore that they had never been there where these people were beaten up. All of them was seated in an automobile at the scene of the strike. And so my criminal lawyer friend that was with me said, well, there goes our case. And I said, no, it doesn't either. He said, what do you mean? I said, give me that pad. And so I took a pad of paper and I drew a rough map of the plant with the streets around it. And I showed the plant to this particular defendant. I said, do you recognize that as a map of the scene there? He said, yes. I said, now take this pen and put an X at the place where the automobile was that you all were all sitting in. And he wouldn't do it. And Judge Lusk told him, he said, you got to do it. Go ahead. So he very reluctantly put an X there where he said it was. I then asked each of the others separately with a fresh map, and they had it all over the place, and I won the case. That is an example of what I think a trial lawyer has to be able to do, and in simple language, it's simply to think on your feet. And it requires more than just knowledge of the law. It requires certain instincts, you might say, and imagination and things of that sort. But that was an interesting case.
Jack, I think for most people who have been practicing law in Tennessee for the last 20 or 25 years are familiar with Don Payne, who conducts a yearly seminar trying to update us on things in the law that has been very helpful. And 4 or 5 years ago, one of Don's interests became using historical cases of interest to illustrate various points. And I have heard him lecture, and he wrote a piece in the Bar Journal that I think he entitled something like The Strange Case of Tom Bunton, yes, which is a case that the Chambliss firm became involved in. Tell us a little bit about it, if you will.
Well, in the 1940s, I guess, there was an insurance man of a prominent family in Nashville, Tennessee, named Thomas Bunton, who was married and had 2 or 3 children. I think he had 2 sons. And one day he just disappeared. And they didn't know what had happened to him. And about 6 weeks later, his secretary disappeared. And sometime after that, his widow filed suit against the New York Life Insurance Company, claiming that he was dead. I guess she must have waited for the 7 years or 6 years or whatever it is. And after that, she filed suit because there's a presumption of death after that length of absence. And so it was tried in circuit court over there, and the judge decided in favor of the plaintiff, and some $40,000 or $50,000 had to be paid over of life insurance, and it was put into the bank headed by the now husband of the wife who had remarried. And so the New York Life had a representative that was wandering around out in Texas for some reason, and in Orange, Texas, he located Tom Bunton.
This was, what, 8 or 10 years after the lawsuit?
10 years later, that's right. And Tom was there, and he was selling used cars, and he had married the secretary and had several children out there. So he took a picture of Tom holding an issue of Life magazine, showing the date and so forth, and he sent it back to the company. And sure enough, it was Tom Bunton. And he admitted it was. So they wanted to get the money back. And so they called down here in Chattanooga and talked to me and my then partner Bill Brown about it, and they said, now we have a lawyer over in Nashville, but we'd rather get you all, we've done a lot of work for them, and would you all file suit and undertake to get this back? We said, sure. So we filed suit in Chancery Court over there before a chancellor named Pink Wade, who was a very fine man and a very good chancellor, and asked that we get the money back because the man hadn't died. Obviously, we weren't obligated for the money unless he had died. Well, they pled laches, they pled all kinds of things, and so the result was that the chancellor held against us. And the case was, we then appealed to the Supreme Court. Well, by that time, the Chief Justice on the Supreme Court was the one who had succeeded my grandfather, and he was Judge Neal, and Justice Neal, Chief Justice Neal. And the Supreme Court then called me up, and he said, the man up there said, listen, we understand that Neal is the one who gave judgment against us in the original trial. Don't you think we ought to ask him to recuse himself? I said, no, do not do that. He was teaching at Cumberland, coming down and teaching at Cumberland when I was in school at Cumberland. And I was very fond of him, and I'd known him closely through the years because of his association with my grandfather. So I said, just leave him be. He's a man of absolute integrity, and leave it alone. And so we went over and argued the case before the Supreme Court. The 5 justices on the Supreme Court, he was the Chief Justice. And we won the case 3-2, and he wrote the deciding opinion. And so our strategy had been proper. But that was what was involved in it. And John Siegenthaler, Sr., way back then, was working for the Tennessean over there, and in some way he got wind of the fact that this is before the suit was brought by us, that he had been found, and he pursued me all over the place and finally caught me up at Knoxville somewhere, and we told him what had happened. Siegenthaler has since retired, I think.
Jack, the sort of the rules of the game have probably changed a good bit. We've gotten a good bit more formal since the time you started practicing law. I think you have told me initially that your grandfather read law and was admitted to the bar in Virginia.
Yeah.
And then I assume that you were admitted to the bar in Tennessee, but your grandfather has come to Tennessee to practice. Your first case you went and tried in Georgia.
Yeah.
I assume from those things that in that day and age, if you were admitted to a bar, that was enough.
Generally speaking, that was true. In other words, if you had been admitted to the bar in anywhere, why, they'd let you practice. It changed after that, although I continued to practice in Georgia. I tried several cases against Frank Gleason down in Lafayette, and I never passed the bar down there. They had what's the system they call it?
Reciprocity?
Reciprocity, yes. Everybody had reciprocity except Florida, I think, and Florida didn't have it.
What I was leading up to here is you have told me about a case of yours that went to the Tennessee Supreme Court and that you lost on an unsigned memorandum opinion. Will you tell us about this situation?
Well, that back in the middle 30s, I was maybe 24, 25 years old. The New York Life had suit brought against it. I think it's $80. And we defended it. My grandfather Sizer had been representing them, so he turned it over to me. And it was over in the mountain country here at Spencer, Tennessee, and it was in Chancery Court for Chancellor Stewart, whose son later became senator from here.
And whose son from there on became the chancellor, and whose son then became chancellor, right?
That's correct.
That's a long, the Stewarts are a long Tennessee family legal history
sure
too,
are.
aren't they?
It's a fine family too. Well, anyway, I took Mr. Charlie Fain, who was a court reporter, and took the case in shorthand. And we drove over in my E-model Ford Roadster and tried the case in the courthouse over there. And it was a rainy day, and the courthouse had holes in the roof of it, and they had buckets sitting around to catch the rain that came down. And it was tried before a jury. And this lady had sued for $80 because an insurance agent for the New York Life had taken it from her as a payment on a policy that she applied for on her uncle. Well, the uncle didn't know anything about it and had not signed the application, and it said on its face that it was invalid unless it had been signed by the prospective insured. Obvious reason for having that was to keep people from taking out a policy on somebody and then killing him. And so anyway, the agent had disappeared. So I tried the case, and it was decided against me, of course, by the jury and the judge. And I came back and I took it to the Court of Appeals, and it went to the Middle Division. And Judge DeWitt over there on the Court of Appeals held in my favor. And so I got it reversed, and I was very jubilant about it. Then the first thing I knew, I got a notice that it was being appealed to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court handed down an unsigned opinion in which it reversed the Court of Appeals and reinstated the judgment. And I didn't know until a long time after that 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 unsigned opinion had been written by my grandfather. And he didn't think that the result was right as it stood, so he reversed it.
During the course of your legal career, you have represented some of Chattanooga's foremost corporations. You have mentioned the Provident, and in recent years the firm has done a lot of work for the McKee Bacon Company.
Yeah, that's a very interesting story. The McKee Company now, I guess, is the biggest single client that our firm has. And that came about this way. In the 1950s, O.D. McKee and Anna McKee came back to Chattanooga from North Carolina, where they had been in business making cookies. And she was a King from Chattanooga, and there was a King's Bakery here, owned by her brother. And so they came back, and her brother was wanting to get out of the business, and so they were operating as King's Bakery at that time. And the Teamsters undertook to organize them. And a large part of my career has been involved in scrapping with unions in one way or another. But anyway, in this case, while they'd shut the place down, but we had this Tennessee law that you don't have to belong to a union. And so I got Chancellor Glenn Woodley to sign an injunction, and I then went through the picket line with Ms. McKee under one arm and Mr. McKee under the other. They were both rather small people. And the strike was over. And about maybe a year later, I had a call from Mr. McKee, and he said, "Jack, would you represent us generally in all of our stuff?" I said, "Sure, but what about the lawyer that you had before?" I won't name him, but I said, "What happened to him?" "Well, we had a foreman quit us and go up to Cleveland and organize a company up there, and he did that for him and is on his board, and we don't like that." I said, "Well, I can understand." So I began to represent them. They moved out from where they were to Collegedale. It grew, and it grew, and it grew. And now it does about $1 billion a year in business and is the biggest company of its sort in the country. Now, O.D. and his wife are both gone now, but I'm a good friend of the company, and they're clients of ours.
In tracing some of these, I guess, high points in your legal career, it is apparent probably that most of the work you have done has been on behalf of management in the labor area, yeah, or representing insurance companies or corporations. But you have also represented plaintiffs in lawsuits, have you not?
Oh, yes.
And I think you have told me that one of the most difficult losses that you recall as a trial lawyer involved representing a widower whose wife had been killed in a train accident. Can you tell us a little bit about that case?
I've forgotten the case.
You had mentioned to me that the woman, I think her car had been stalled on the track.
Oh, sure, I remember. Oh, that was, I know what you mean. This was a countryman from down in North Georgia around Tunnel Hill, a rather small man and just a very plain person who came to me. And he had a chicken farm. He raised chickens. That's one of the big industries around here in recent years. And his wife really did the operation. He had a bad heart and couldn't work much. And his wife had been in an automobile going into town, and she came to a crossing there on the Southern Railroad, and her car got stuck on the crossing. and a train was coming. It was quite a distance away. And she kept trying to get it started and couldn't do it. So finally, at the last moment, she flung open the door, jumped out of the car, and started running away from it. But the train hit the front of the car, slewed around the back of the car, and slammed her up against the locomotive and killed her. And I had that case. And Jack Lusk represented the other side. And we tried it in federal court. And I put on the proof, and I got the engineer to admit that he didn't apply the brakes. He didn't sound the whistle, anything like that. So I thought I had just a perfect case. And it went to the jury. Well, the jury considered it that afternoon and then adjourned till the next day. And the next morning, I had a board meeting somewhere, and I didn't go to court, but I sent Mitch Crawford over in my place. He was a partner of mine. And Mitch called me out of the meeting a while later, and he said, Jack Lusk has offered us $50,000. I said, take it. He said, our client won't take it. I said, he's crazy. Go on and take it. Well, he wouldn't take it. And so the jury went out again, and came in with a verdict for the defendant. Well, I was almost literally sick. I couldn't see how in the world it happened. But 2 or 3 days later, the man came to see me, and he said, Mr. Chambliss, I want to tell you something. I want to apologize to you for not settling that case. He said, my daughter was with me, and that second day when we came into court before the jury decided the case, she had a friend who was on the jury. And the friend looked over at her and held up his hand like this. And she thought that meant okay, and it didn't. So that was a loss. You win some, you lose some, and they asked me why I liked being a trial lawyer, and I said because I like boxing, and it's like boxing. They said, do you enjoy being hit? I said, no, I never enjoyed being hit. I enjoy hitting the other guy without being hit myself. And so that's kind of the way it is. But unless you have a particular temperament, why, of course, you don't like it. But I happen to like it.
In discussing some of your trials earlier, you have told me about one that turned on, I think, a wonderful small bit of cross-examination. And it was a case in which the issue was whether a widow could collect the double indemnity portion of some life insurance policies.
That's
Can
right.
you tell us a little bit about that case?
Yes, this was about 20 years ago, I guess. And I got up in the morning and read a squib in the paper about a doctor, a local doctor, having died as a result of a gunshot wound. And I thought, uh-oh. And sure enough, he was heavily insured to the extent of maybe $400,000 or $500,000. And his policies had double indemnity provisions, which meant that if he died as a result of external violent and accidental means, it paid double. Well, the companies paid off the face amount, but they refused to pay the other. And I represented them in a trial in federal court before a jury. And it was before Frank Wilson, who was one of the best judges we've ever had anywhere, really, he and his predecessor. But we tried the case for a week, and I had taken the discovery deposition of the wife ahead of time and asked her what had happened. She said, we were at home. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening, 6:30, and he was at home, and he was walking around in his underwear, as he frequently did, and he was looking at the news, and he finally said something like, well, I can't take this anymore. And so he went back to the bedroom, and the door to the bedroom was ajar. And I kept on looking at the program, and all of a sudden I heard this shotgun go off. And I looked up, and I saw the figure of my husband falling with blood all over him. And I said, what did you do then? She said, well, I got up, and I went to the door, and I took the handle of the door, and I pulled it closed. And I walked to the other end of the house and called a doctor. Well, I didn't say anything at the time of the discovery about that. But when we came to the trial and we got to that point, I said to her, why did you do what you did? Why did you close the door? She never answered. And I told the jury, I said, that is the most eloquent testimony I've ever elicited from a witness, and the jury found for us. The judge had charged the jury that the burden of proof was on them to prove an accident, not on us to prove suicide. And so that's the way the case went.
In discussing some of these cases from your career, that's, I guess, a pretty good example of the productive uses of discovery.
Yeah.
And you have also given us some examples of cases that turned on a lawyer being able to think on his feet in a day before discovery. In general terms, tell us some about how you see the evolution in the law, at least of the trial process, and how maybe you would compare where you see us being today with where we have been.
Of course, way back then, you could call the opposite party as a hostile witness, which wasn't discovery, but you were bound by the testimony. And that made it a thing that people very seldom did. I think that, well, first let me say this. I think that lawyers in law school, since I went to law school, are trained very differently. Back when I went to law school, we studied books about the theory of the law. For example, we would study, our main thing at Cumberland was History of a Lawsuit by Carruthers. And then we studied this one on equity, and we studied this one on chancery, and this one on criminal. But we studied about legal principles, and then the cases evolved from there. But now they've started this case system, and you study cases, and it's going backwards as I see it. And I think the lawyers needed more to know about the underlying theories and philosophies of the law than they did about cases. Cases are the result, and you need to get back to the cause. But anyhow, in the practice generally, of course, we did not have discovery, and when that came along, I thought that was a good idea. But as I've watched it, I have seen it used as a tool to destroy litigants, and lawyers for a big company can destroy a plaintiff just by taking so much discovery that his expenses. So, and that brings up another thing. The lawyers, when I began, they didn't charge on a time basis. And today it's become a business. And so you get paid by the hour like a bricklayer does. And I don't think that's right. My grandfather Chambliss told me one time, he says there are 4 bases for charging a client. The first is the importance of the thing. The second is the results you obtain. The third is the amount of effort and time that had to go into it. And the fourth, and one of the most important, is the client's ability to pay. And so it's so different now. I really don't like it. It's turned the law in large measure from being a profession into being a business. And the chief objective of a profession is and should be to help people. Whereas the chief objective of a business is to make money. And that's perfectly legitimate as a business, but as a profession, I don't think it is. I think a lot of lawyers don't like it. A lot of my lawyers here hate the system, really, of turning in all these hours. You see, you hire a young lawyer, you say you've got to produce so many hours, billable hours. If you don't, out you go. Well, that immediately creates an antagonism between him and the client. And it keeps him in a jittery state all the time. Lawyers are in a squirrel cage now, and it wouldn't be fun. Another thing, the lawyers are not as good friends as they used to be.
Why don't we take a break, Jack, and then we'll come back and finish.
Yes,
During our recess, you mentioned one other case that you had been involved in that certainly had an interesting factual situation, and it was one growing out of the realm of professional baseball. And I wonder if you'll tell our audience a little bit about that.
It was a fascinating case. I had a call from Jack Norman, who was one of the top lawyers in Nashville, who represented the Nashville Ball Club. And it seems that they had been playing a game with the Chattanooga Lookouts. And I think it took place here in Chattanooga. And the Chattanooga Lookouts had a very fine hitter. I've forgotten what his name was now. But he was at bat, and the Nashville pitcher dusted him and threw the ball close to his head, whereupon the batter threw his bat in the direction of the pitcher. And when he did that, the Nashville catcher rose up from behind and slugged the guy at the plate who had thrown the bat and broke his jaw badly. I think he says, I want you to represent the catcher, and I'll represent the rest of the team. And I said, okay. So we tried the case and before a jury, and those were the facts. And at the conclusion of the proof, Jack Norman asked for a directed verdict for the ball club, arguing that they had hired him to play baseball and not to slug people.
Not in the scope of his employment.
That was outside the scope of his employment, and the judge sustained it. I was somewhat surprised, but anyhow, he sustained it. Well, that left my client, of course, hanging in the wind, shall we say. And so the plaintiff's lawyer got up and argued his case. They had medical damage, I think, medical cost of $7,500. And he had sued for $75,000, which was a large sum back then. And he argued his case for the plaintiff. And I then stood up to argue for the defense. And I walked over to the jury box, and I said, you know, I've never known of a case like this. I said, everybody has gone off and left my client. And I think I will too. I turned around and walked back to the counsel table and started to sit down. You could have heard a pin drop. Then I stood back up and I said, before I sit down, I want to say this. Consider this situation. This man has been hurt. He has got doctor's bills of $7,500. My man did something instinctive. It was not premeditated. It was instinctive. I ask you to go out and give a judgment for the plaintiff for $7,500. And that's what they did. And that stemmed from my friendship with Bill Spears.
Now, for the younger generation, tell us a little bit about Bill Spears.
Bill Spears, who was about 5 years older than I, was born over in Squatchy Valley, and his family moved over to Chattanooga when he was a boy. And he went to Macaulay School. And he was a small kid, never weighed over about 145 pounds when he was in prep school, and was a very fine football player. He used to practice at his family home out in Highland Park. He put up on the side of the barn, he painted a circle, and he would go out there and practice throwing the ball. And so when he got through high school, his father suggested that he go to Sewanee, because he said, you can't make the team in a big school. And Bill said, I'd rather be a small frog in a big pond than a little frog in a small pond. I'm going to Vanderbilt. And he went to Vanderbilt. And his last year at Vanderbilt, he was All-American. And it was Grantland Rice's first All-American team. And he named Bill Spears, who weighed 155 at that time, as the All-American quarterback. Well, Bill, he went to law school at Vanderbilt and then practiced law with his coach. Who was the coach?
McGugan.
McGugan. He and McGugan were real close friends. And he practiced there for a couple of years and then came back over here where his father was practicing and practiced here from then on. I had not known him before. There was just enough difference in our age that he was an older guy. But he and I got to be friends, and I had a lawsuit against him a small lawsuit, which I won. He later I had a big one against him, and he won. But he and I got to be very close friends. And he told me something that a lot of people don't realize, and it's a very valuable thing to know. He said, Jack, if you're trying a case and you've got a bad case, don't try to say that you don't have. Admit that it's a bad case, and then show extenuating circumstances. And I've done it again and again. Shortly after he told me that, the power board got sued because one of their people there was driving a car, and it was raining fresh, and he ran into a car that was stopped in front to make a left turn because he skidded into it. And another lawyer represented these 4 people who were in the car and wanted, I think, $13,000 or $15,000 in settlement. And in that case, I told the jury, I said, I want you to do something that you've never heard of before. I want you to give judgment against my client. But it was not his fault. It was an accident. He did everything he could to avoid it. They gave a judgment for $1,300. And it embittered the other lawyer forever. In fact, when he argued the case to the jury, he says, my opponent, speaking of me, is from Lookout Mountain, and he's got all these wealthy clients, and I'm from out here at Soddy Daisy, and my father's a coal miner, and blah, blah, blah. Had nothing to do with it, and that didn't help him at all. But what Bill taught me there, I've used many, many times. And when Bill was a person who was very friendly on the surface, but he didn't have many close friends. And I was perhaps his closest. And on Lookout Mountain, I had a house that had a big side lot attached to it, and he bought that south end of the lot and built his home there and lived there until he died. And he was a great guy. We used to ride horseback together, and he loved to recite poetry, and I loved to recite poetry, and so we had that in common.
You mentioned him as having an influence on you in the baseball case. He was not directly involved in that case, was he?
No, but it was the philosophy that he had expressed about how if you have a bad case, why, take advantage of it. And you'll get the sympathy of the jury, and they will try to help you.
One aspect of your career that we haven't touched on is you did serve during the Second World War, did you not? And there's an aspect of that that's connected with Bill Spears and changing times in the law.
That's right. When World War II came along, I was 33. I had been practicing law 12 years, and I was doing quite well. And my close friend, William Ralph, had gone in the service, and I was over at the Rowell's house, and Mr. Gaston Rowell, his father, was head of the draft board. And he told me in October of 1943, he said, Jack, I want to tell you, your number's up, and you're going to be drafted. I said, well, if that's the way it is, that's the way it is. Wife and 3 children. And he says, why don't you take a commission? You can get a commission, I'm sure, probably in JAG or something like that. I said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to go in just at the bottom. And so I was drafted, and in December, I went out to Fort Oglethorpe, and they gave me an option, which I didn't realize would be done. They said, do you want the Army or the Navy? I said, I want the Navy. And I got the Navy. And I and about 100 others were put on a troop train, so to speak, the middle of the night, and sent up to Great Lakes outside Chicago, where I took my boot training. And there were, of course, about 96 or thereabout in the company, but they made me acting chief petty officer because I was the oldest one, because I'd been to VMI and I knew how to drill and do things like that. And so I enjoyed it. It was in the dead of winter, and it was terribly cold. But after I finished there, they gave me tests of various sorts and commissioned me then and sent me to Princeton to officers training for maybe 2 months or something like that. And after I had completed that, they sent me down to the Gulf Coast to gunnery school at Gulfport, and then assigned me as a Lieutenant JG to Armed Guard out in the South Pacific. And I went on a ship, and we went out the latter part of the year. I guess it was early December, late November, and went out to the South.
Was this in 1943?
This was in 1944. I was taken in 43, and I was sent out in December of 44. And my ship went through the canal and went out to New Guinea and stayed at anchor for a while, and then went up to the Philippines. And after being at anchor there, my ship unloaded. It was a Liberty ship, and I had a crew of 28 on it, gun crew, and we unloaded at a place called Iloilo, which is the capital city of an island in the Philippines called Panay, P-A-N-A-Y, Panay Island, one of the larger islands. As it was being unloaded, the Army officer in charge of the unloading and I got to be friends. He'd been a Golden Gloves boxer in Chicago, and I'd been Golden Gloves boxer here and in Memphis. And we both liked poetry. We were about the same age. He said, I want to come down tomorrow and get you and take you uptown to a place where some of us are billeted, and it's a place that's occupied by a Spanish family who were trapped here by the war. Spain was not in the war. So he came and got me in his Jeep, and we went up there, and I met this family. There was the father, who was about 50, the mother, who was about 35, and 4 children. There was a girl 16, a boy 14, a boy 12, and a girl 9. I was there about 10 days, 15 days. I was able to bring them things they hadn't seen since the war, soap and all kinds of things like that. And so it was something big in their lives. And it was big in my life, because after the war, I kept in touch with them. They moved back to Pamplona in Spain. And Anne, our oldest daughter, who was the same age as their youngest daughter, went to Connecticut College and took her junior year at St. Andrews in Scotland, and was invited for Christmas of 1955 down to Pamplona, Spain, to spend Christmas with that family, the La Cambra family. Well, shortly after that, I went home and found Bina in tears, my wife. And I said, what's the matter? She says, we've just gotten a letter from Anne, and she's fallen in love with that Spanish Roman Catholic. She was devastated. Well, anyway, the following summer, I took Bina and the 2 younger children. We went by ship to Europe. I took a train down to northern Spain and met Laura La Cambra. The husband had died by then, but met Laura and Jose Marie.
Laura's the mother?
That Laura's the mother, who was a most beautiful woman, who has a granddaughter right now by our daughter Anne, who is just as beautiful.
And is also a Laura?
Is also a Laura, and who paints beautiful oil paintings and gets paid thousands of dollars apiece, and is married and has our 2 great-grandchildren, the first one named Jac, J-A-C, and the second one named Will.
So the service experience, in a way,
it paid
led
off.
to a family relationship, didn't it?
It sure did.
Tell us, if you will.
Jose Marie, by the way, my son-in-law, came to this country, worked his way through Gettysburg College waiting on tables, and then was given a full scholarship to go to Duke University and get his PhD in nuclear physics, which he did. And he's just retired as a nuclear physicist with the Martin Company.
They live in Winter Park, Florida,
Winter Park, Florida. That's correct.
Tell us, if you will, what a lawyer who's going off to war during World War II does with his law practice.
Well, he does the best he can. In my case, since Kefauver and Burnett Sizer and so forth had moved out, I just left it with my father and my brother Sizer. And they held the thing together while I was gone. Let me add this one note. My father was having a difficult time these years because the same month that I was drafted, he got a telegram that my youngest brother had been killed in England. And that had really shaken him. And that led to some other things that don't have anything to do with the law, but it was a hard time for him. But he, during the time I was gone, he went over to Webb School, where I'd graduated and my brothers had graduated, gave a commencement address over there, which I have a copy of that was real good.
That's in Bell Buckle, Tennessee?
That's in Bell Buckle, Tennessee.
That's
right.
one of the oldest prep schools in the state, isn't it?
Sure
Maybe
is.
the oldest.
Started in 1875, I think, something like that, by old Sonny Webb, who'd been in the Confederate Army.
Well, now, you also have had the occasion to give the commencement address at the Webb School, haven't you?
I've been on the board since the 1950s and have given at least 5 commencement addresses over there. My being on the board led to my having a case for Webb School. Old Sonny Webb, who started it, died my senior year, 1926. I graduated in 27. He was succeeded by his son Will. And he ran the school until the 1950s, when he came apart mentally. And the board got rid of him. It was very painful. And he then got John Hooker to bring a suit against the board for letting him go. And we tried it in Shelbyville, in Chancery Court, before a jury. And Tyree Harris and John J. Hooker Sr. tried it.
Two prominent Nashville lawyers.
That's right. I'll never forget when I argued. Well, first I'll tell you what my strategy was. I said, let me cross-examine son Will, because I'd learned that we were safe unless we had done this thing malevolently, you might say, and in bad faith. And son Will took the stand and testified, and then I cross-examined him. I said, now, Mr. Webb, I said, I'm one of your boys, am I not? He said, yeah. And all these other defendants here, they're your boys. That's right. And they would not do anything unconscionable or evil or wicked towards you, would they? He said, no. That was the case. We argued it to the jury, and I told the jurors, I said, now I want you to watch, I've forgotten whether it was John Hooker or whether it was Tyree, which one, but I said, he's going to get up there, and he'll make his points, and he'll raise his hand like that, and he'll slap it down like that, and you just count how many times he does it. And they began doing it and looking, and it completely discombobulated. The jury went out and came back 11-1 in our favor, and the case was dropped.
Let's back up a minute to the Second World War.
Sure.
In terms of your clients at that time, you've told us about some personal difficulties your father has had.
Yeah.
There's a story that Bill Spears is involved in here, is there not?
Oh, yes. Well, Bill and I by that time were close friends, and Bill was older than I, and he was not drafted. And our biggest client, two of our biggest clients then, were a combustion engineering company, which my grandfather Sizer had started out by representing in when it was Casey Hedges, and it became combustion, and it was a big client. And I turned combustion over to Bill Spears when I left. I also turned the Wheeling Company, another large manufacturing company, over to Bill Spears, and he took care of them. At combustion, he worked closely with my very close friend Sam Perry, who died a few years back and who was the greatest guy I ever knew, really. Sam Perry was incomparable. And when I came back from the war, he turned combustion back over to me, but Wheeling wouldn't come back. It had been sold to new owners. And since it wouldn't come back, he quit representing, and they got another firm. But Bill was that way. And there was a very deep affection between the two of us, which led me to, when he died, write a column which I sent to the paper, but I don't know that they ever printed it. It was about a dream that I had the night that he died, and I don't know that we want to go into it. But
Turning your best client over to a lawyer in another law firm obviously shows a great deal of reciprocal trust among members of the legal profession.
Yeah.
Do you think that that would happen today?
From what I know of it today, and of course I'm only on the fringes, I seldom go into court anymore, and I don't know the lawyers. But from what I hear about the relationship between lawyers and law firms today, I can't imagine it happening. Which is another sadness, and it comes from various things. It comes from a change in the public climate. It comes from the change in the way you practice law. It comes from a change in, the whole approach to the thing. And if I did not suggest that my granddaughter, or our granddaughter, study law, Margaret McLean, but she took the law aptitude test and scored 93. She says, I think I ought to do this. And so she went to law school and did quite well out in Seattle. She's been practicing out there now for a year as a public defender, and I got a call last night from her sister, who's just moved out there and is looking for a job in another area. She told me that Margaret had been trying a case the day before in the court out there defending someone, and that this state trooper who was against her, testifying against her, had testified as he should not have. And so Margaret objected and moved for a mistrial. And the woman judge said, I don't have any authority. I can't find any authority for granting a mistrial on that. But she said, now, Margaret, if you want, I'll give you 15 minutes. And it's 5 minutes from Margaret's office to the courthouse. She ran to her office. She found the authority. She ran back again, gave it to the judge, and got the mistrial. Now, there again is an example of thinking on your feet. So it's still existent, but a lot of lawyers can't do it.
For the sake of completeness, why don't you tell us about all of your children? We've mentioned your oldest daughter, Anne, is married to Jose LaCambra.
That's right.
Tell us about the McLeans. You've just mentioned a granddaughter, McLean.
Well, our younger daughter, Betsy, finished North Carolina and went up to Boston and got a job up there for the John Hancock through the help of my close friend, Abram T. Collier, who was general counsel there and went on to be president of New England Life. And he and I are still very, very close. And we got acquainted through the Association of Life Insurance Council. Well, anyway, while Betsy was up there, she'd been there a year or so, she went to a cocktail party that she didn't want to go to, and with a friend. And at the party, she was on crutches because she had cracked her ankle. She'd been down to Chattanooga to attend her brother John's wedding, played tetherball, and cracked her ankle. So she was on crutches. And there was a big guy, black-headed guy there, on crutches. And, of course, they gravitated together. And he said to her, why are you on crutches? And she told him. And she said to him, why are you? He said, well, he said, I was in the Marine Corps in Vietnam. And last February, I was out on patrol, and a landmine went off and blew off both my legs. And so he was back up there trying to get in graduate school at Harvard, where he graduated, from whence he had gone into the Marine Corps, was a second lieutenant in Vietnam, and went out on patrol a second time in one night, and the wire was tripped. His radio man was killed. He had both legs blown off, one above the knee, one below the knee. He tied tourniquets around, crawled over to the radio and called for help. A week later, he was in the Naval Hospital at Philadelphia. And he is a most extraordinary guy. They have 3 children themselves. Margaret, the lawyer, is the oldest. Rob, the second, is in medical school. And Mary, the youngest one, graduated at North Carolina this year and is out in Seattle looking for a job.
The McLeans live in Arkansas?
Betsy and Alan, well, they married, and he went with the people that, what's the name of the, begins with a P, that in the flour and business.
Pillsbury?
Pillsbury. He went with Pillsbury as their chief financial officer in France. And they lived in France 6 years and had 2 of the 3 children. Then came back here. He went back with them and didn't like the big company thing, went with a smaller company. Betsy developed cancer, ovarian cancer, and survived. And after that, he said, now I want to do what I've always wanted to do. She says, what's that? Be an Episcopal priest. So he went to seminary, 3 years, and is an Episcopal priest, and his church is in Pine Bluff, Arkansas.
Sandwiched between the 2 daughters is your son. Tell us about him.
And John had about as stormy an educational career as his father and his grandfather. He went to Southwestern for a time. Then he went to the university here. Then he went to law school, but it was not for him. And so John is in the middle, and he is married. He has a son, John the Fourth. You know, you run out of numbers after a while, and actually he's about John the Seventh, but it becomes ridiculous after a while. And I figured that while I was John A. Chambliss, the oldest, I should be John A. Chambliss, and my son should be John A. Chambliss Jr., the younger, alive. But it gets screwed up. And Paul here is a good example. His father is still Paul Campbell Jr., and he likes it that way. And John Odie Carter Jr., who was with the Provident, died at 93, and he was still John Odie Carter Jr. His senior was in heaven, of course. But anyway, that's just one of the quirks of language, I guess.
Now, you have made reference to your wife, Bina McVeigh.
I met Bina McVeigh in 1932, right after trying the dog lawsuit. And I'd gone to a dance up at the Signal Mountain Country Club with another girl. And at the dance, after it was over, and I hadn't noticed Bina at all, Bobby Twynham, who was a court reporter, not a court reporter, a reporter here for the Chattanooga News, came up to me and he said, Jack, I want to introduce you to someone. I said, that's fine. So he took me over to the cloakroom where the girls were coming out and introduced me to Bina. And he was one of these nuts on the South. He said, Miss Bina McVeigh, I want you to meet Marse Jac Chambliss. And so she met Marse Jac Chambliss, and her accent was so heavy, Louisiana accent, that I thought she was foreign. Well, that appealed to me. I'm an incorrigible romantic, and so anything that was foreign would appeal to me. So that's the way we became acquainted. And she was a challenge. I remember the first time I took her somewhere. As we were walking to the car, I said, do you mind if I hold your hand? She says, not if it gives you any pleasure. And that impressed me. I recognized that as a challenge. And from there, it went on, and we were married in 1934 in Baton Rouge.
And still are.
And still are.
You mentioned meeting your wife-to-be through the friendship with the man who wrote for the newspaper.
Yeah.
And actually, although I don't guess you've ever been employed by newspapers, you've done a good bit of writing for the newspaper over the years, haven't you?
Yes, I started back in the 30s, and as a matter of fact, I have published one collection of some of my columns, ranging from the ones in the 30s to the 40s to the 50s to the 60s and so forth. And I call it Columns Left. And the first thing that I ever wrote was a letter, not a column, to the paper about a Roland Hayes who had come here and sung at the place, the Memorial Auditorium. And I called it, He Stood and Clasped His Hands and He Sang. And he did. It was a cappella. And it was a tremendously moving experience. And I wrote a letter, and I didn't sign it. I just put J.C. behind it. And Christine Govan then wrote the paper and said, who in the world is J.C.? And they found out. And for years, I then started writing columns, and the first column in my book is one about a little tailor who died in the mid-1930s. I was about 26 when that was written. But the editor of the Times was Alfred Minders, and he and I were close friends. And when I was in the Pacific, I would write and send them back to him, and he would publish them. And several of those are in the book. And after he died, Norman Bradley became editor. And Norman and I were close friends. And then he died, and Mark Knox became, and we were not that close. And finally, in later years, I became too conservative for the Times. I wrote a column called The Black Man's Burden that I thought was a good column, and they thought it was bad.
You have had varied and wide interests in your personal life. We have touched on boxing and horseback riding and your writing for the newspaper, your love of poetry. You've also written some poetry.
Yeah.
And at least for some of us in the family, you're a very distinguished color photographer. You have some artistic interests and have for a long time.
I was thinking just last night, how many lives is it that a cat's supposed to have? 9? I've got 9 lives. I've got a life athletically, I've got a life as a poet, I've got a life as a photographer. And each one of them is connected but is different from the others. And I had never thought of it before. And I started writing down the different ones, and I finally quit it. But you're right, I've had that. And I have a set of books. I'm on volume 17 now, most of which are leather-bound books, and which I started buying in Italy years ago. Then they cost about $15 or $20. Now they're $125. But I get these books with beautiful pages that have nothing on them, and I fill them up. And they're commonplace books. And I started it in 1960. And I'm on volume 17 now. And of course it may be the last, it may not be the last. But in it are things that happen, ideas that occur, things that I think are worth talking about. And I was inspired to that by a commonplace book put out by a lawyer in Boston named Charles P. Curtis, who with a man named Greenslet edited a book called The Practical Cogitator. That is one of the great books of my life. And it's quotes from all sorts of people through history, really, and just full of ideas, crammed with ideas. And that moved me to start my own series of commonplace books, which I call De Vita, De Morte, of life and death. And I'm continuing that. I wrote in it just last night, as a matter of fact.
Your reference to Boston makes me think of New York. And if we read, for example, the biographical data on you in Martindale Hubble, one of the interesting things that shows there is your membership in the Association of the Bar of the City of New York. I wonder if you'd tell us how that came about.
That came about in the 1930s. I had a number of noteworthy things then. In 1936, when I was 25, I went to Washington on a case involving the constitutionality of the NLRB. No, not the NLRB, the NRA, where the government controlled prices and production and so forth, and it was ruled unconstitutional. And I was introduced to the Supreme Court, so I've been a member of the Bar of the Supreme Court since 1936.
All right, help the youngers in the audience. The NRA stood for?
National Recovery Act. And Roosevelt started it. It was the depth of the Depression, and he decided that the government should control hours and wages and production and so forth, just like they did in Russia, actually. And my father was interested in having that declared unconstitutional, which it was. And it was declared in another case than ours. It was declared in the Schechter case, which they referred to as the chicken case because it involved a chicken farm and the production of chickens. And the Supreme Court said that the government couldn't do that it was beyond their constitutional powers. But anyhow, about that same time, he conceived the idea that I should belong to the Association of the Bar of the City of New York. And so he put me up for membership, and I was elected. I've never attended a meeting. I get their literature, most of which I disagree with because I'm more conservative than they, I guess. But it's very stimulating and interesting. And he got to know a lot of big people like Wigmore and Well, Henry Stimson, who was Secretary of State back then, was with him at the Bar Association in 1924 in London, and Dad loaned him his trousers. Stimson didn't have the proper trousers, so Dad decided to just wear a suit and lend him his trousers so he could wear a dress suit. But he got to know all kinds of people like that.
Your father was very interested in the American Bar Association at one time.
He sure was. Yes, in 1916, 18, he and Mother would go to the Bar Association in Denver and things like that. I never got into it. I guess I was too interested in too many other things.
Just for a minute, back on your father, he also served in the Tennessee State Senate for at least a term, and in the House of Representatives.
What he did, he ran for the State Senate in 1929, was elected and went, and then 2 years later, he ran for the lower house. And he said, "I'm the only duck that flies backward." And then 20 years later, he went to the Constitutional Convention and was very active in that, along with Cecil Sims, who was a close friend.
That's I guess, one of the founding partners at Bass Berry & Sims.
That's right.
Another membership that you hold that, of course, is not related to the law, but is one that I find interesting, that I think you might tell us about, is the Royal Society of Arts. I think of you as being, at least locally, one of the foremost Anglophiles I know, and I guess, I don't know whether you can remember how many times you've been to England, but tell us a little bit about that, if you will.
Well, it all stems, I guess, from the fact that our father instilled in us this Anglophile attitude. He began by reading Conan Doyle and W.W. Jacobs and Shakespeare, and especially Kipling. And I remember memorizing Horatius at the Bridge, for example, which is not Kipling, but also Kipling's poems. And then he took us over there in 1929 and took the others over in later years. And then in the 1950s, he was developing reflection writing. And he became interested in English landscape architects. And he ended up by going to England and talking to Nan Fairbrother and others who were interested in gardens. She wrote a book called Men in Gardens. It's a marvelous book. It's a fun book. And as a result, he went to the Royal Society of Arts and gave them a rather large sum of Providence stock to fund lectures on landscape. And the first lecture was held in the early 1960s or maybe late 1950s, and my brother Bob presided. Then I was the next one to preside on one and over one, and that was in about 1969, I guess. And after that was over, the president of the society, who was then Sir James Taylor, came to me and he said, "I wonder if you would be willing to give the next lecture." I said, on landscape. And I said, "Sure." Whereupon my wife bawled me out and said, "You nut, you don't know one flower from another," and blah, 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 which was a typical wifely approach. And I said, "Don't worry about it. I'm going to talk on the therapy of landscape." And so I did. And I gave a talk on the therapy of landscape and what it does for you. And I showed them 50 color slides from over the world of landscape that will really take your breath away, or that tells a story. And it went over just great. And since that time, I have presided over either 2 or 3 more. But I get their literature, and there was a friendship between John Skidmore, who published their magazine.
He was the secretary, I guess.
He was the secretary of the thing, and he also was in charge of publishing the magazine. And he was a very typical Englishman, small, narrow-shouldered, carried a tightly furled umbrella, and wore a bowler hat or things like that. And
had been to Oxford.
Been to Oxford, absolutely. Never married. And he was a most interesting person. And he and the Campbell family became good friends, I know. And he came over when Doug got married.
Right. The Royal Society is of course, not household word around here, but
It-
it's over, what,
It was founded
250
in
years old?
1754 to promote arts and sciences and commerce, and it's existed ever since, and it does the same thing. It's gotten to be a pretty big thing, and the head of it is the crowning, well, is Prince Philip. He's the head of it now, and I don't know who will be the next, but it's usually a royal head, and then they have, of course, a president and so on and so forth.
And it was the original society in England to sort of push the cause of the
Yes,
arts.
now, it's a different thing from the Royal Society, which is given to people who great accomplishments in science or mathematics or this, that, or the other. And this is different from that.
Well, let's come back to southeast Tennessee and go back in time a little bit. One of the things that I have neglected to ask you about are the conditions under which you first started practicing law.
Well, they were very different from now. For example, the courts, we had locally, we had the Justice of the Peace Courts. We had about 6 or 8 of those, and these were people who were not lawyers, but who were members of the county court. And therefore, they heard small claims and criminal matters, which in the criminal thing, they would bind them over to the grand jury. And then they had the circuit court, and they had the chancery court on top of that. But the courthouse was a very different place. It smelled differently. It smelled of tobacco, and it had spittoons all over the place, and it was just a different world then. It wasn't as sterile as it is now.
Didn't have any air conditioning, did it?
Had no air conditioning, and when we tried cases in the circuit court, the windows were all open, and the streetcars would come grinding up the hill and make so much noise that you'd have to stop the trial while they went by.
How were you paid as a starting lawyer? Did it bear any similarity to how starting lawyers in big firms are paid today?
No. I started out, they paid me $50 a month. And when I got married, which was 2 years later, they raised me to $100 a month. And then I went to them a year later and I said, I'll make you a deal. Why don't you give me, in addition to that, half of what I bring in? And so after 2 years, I was bringing in so much that they made me a partner, and I took a reduction. But now, of course, they bring these lawyers in and pay them, gosh, I can't believe it, they pay them 60, 70, 80, and in some places they pay them $100,000 when they just start out. But they then tell them, now listen, you've got to produce billable hours. We've got to have that to pay you. And that immediately puts them in the squirrel cage, and they stay in the squirrel cage from then on.
Jack, there is one other part of your involvement in the life of Chattanooga that I think is important, and that deals with what was once called the Good Government League.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was an important part of my life. I had never been interested in politics particularly, but I got back from the Navy, and up in Athens, Tennessee, they had had a revolt of the soldiers and sailors that had come home against machine politics up there. They even had a physical war.
Drove some of them over into Meigs County or someplace, didn't they?
That's right. And I came back and organized an outfit called the Good Government League, the Citizens Good Government League. It started out being the GI Citizens Good Government League. And there were 2 other fellows that were starting the same thing, and they came in with me, and as a result, we produced the Citizens Good Government League, which consisted at most of about 50 people, and it was nonpartisan, and we would back individuals regardless of party, and we would also back causes regardless of party. And we pretty effectively broke up machine politics here in Hamilton County. And it functioned for maybe 30 years, and then as we got older, why, it became less. Our last real campaign was Gary Gerbitz, who we got to run for Attorney General, and we got him to run because our candidate, who was already in the race, died 2 months before the election, and we turned in desperation to someone else, and somebody suggested Gary Gerbitz, and so I took him out to Reflection Riding and said, would you let us back you? And he said, I can't be elected. I said, why not? He says, I'm a Yankee, and I have a name that sounds like a detergent. And I said, well, that's an asset, because it'll clean things up. And so we ran him, and he was elected.
His career has He spent, I guess, about 20 years as the district attorney, and then was appointed to the criminal court bench by Governor Sundquist.
That's
and
right.
I think he's currently sitting on the special Tennessee Supreme Court that
That's
is looking at the constitutionality of the Tennessee Plan or
That's
some
right.
such question. Another part of that I think is interesting, at least by apocryphal story, he had been a fairly liberal Democrat
Yes.
before he was selected as just being a qualified man for the job, and ran as a Republican then.
Yeah, that's right.
There are all sorts of aspects of your life and career that I think we could go on about, but if you had to say how you would like to be remembered, or how you would like the family or the firm's place to be positioned, how would you describe that for us?
Somebody asked me not long ago what was the most important thing in life. And I said people and friends. And I have felt that way all the while. I like people, and I like getting things done. And there's nothing like friends. I've had several young lawyers that I've been able to give a push to, and that's made a big difference. And I guess Joe Nichols, who was vice president of Providence, later became an Episcopal priest, and he was dead now, and I were close. And when I went in the Navy, he gave me a little book, and in the front of it, it said, for Jack, who is going away from us for a while, quote, a little friend to all the world, unquote. And I like that best of all.
It's a wonderful tribute, and I know you have had many very meaningful friendships, and I think you and your family have been amazing friends to the Tennessee legal profession, and we thank you.
Thank you.